We see examples of algorithmic bias, privacy invasions, and more. And it's left a lot of us wondering how to use algorithms ethically. There are lots of different approaches for how people have been working on what we're calling AI ethics or other fields, other names. So academics have done some especially great work on things like audits and creating standards for documentation and workflows. Journalists and even tech workers at companies have been able to contribute based on their roles as well. And some of the most powerful entities have been companies and governments, which have been trying to approach the problem in a top-down way by articulating values and principles. So there are hundreds of top-down principles that different organizations have each articulated. We see that Google lists some abstract, but certainly noble-sounding goals. Facebook too says that it cares about things like privacy and accountability. IBM says something similar, and so forth. But this top-down principles-based approach is often very abstract and difficult to engage with. Everyone agrees, for instance, that the process should be fair, but we don't have the policies and norms in place to decide whether something is or isn't fair when a new issue arises. So instead of a top-down approach, I propose a bottom-up approach, where we learn not from what people say, but instead what they do. My approach draws inspiration from the evidence-based medicine movement, which was created 30 years ago to standardize ad hoc decision-making and make sense of developing research in medicine. EBM discussions can get caught up in many details, but the basic idea is intuitive. We should study what's been tried, distill best practices, and then promote those lessons learned. Of course, there are key differences between medicine and AI. In medicine, they look to things like randomized controlled trials as the gold standard, although they also do have things like observational studies and clinical expertise that they learn from. What is the analog? What should we do for AI? How can we extract evidence from a given case study? We can use reflexive methods to examine our work, doing things like algorithmic audits and examining power. So in this work, I use two complementary frameworks to help extract evidence from projects. They have different points of emphasis, which help measure different takeaways from the case studies. Effective altruism is a movement based on utilitarianism. EA communities have developed frameworks for how to measure which choices will do the most good for the most number of people. Data feminism, on the other hand, is based on intersectional feminism. It critically examines data science as a form of power, and rather than looking to maximizing the expected average, it focuses on the people at the bottom of power structures and how they're affected. And these two different lenses provide different tools for extracting evidence from projects. In this work, I analyzed 5 different case studies, from primarily technical work like deep learning and differential privacy to work influenced by sociology, like tech worker collective action. During today's presentation, I will focus on 3 of these projects, the top row here. For each case study, I will first describe the project and its results, and then I will demonstrate how to use concepts from effective altruism and data feminism to interrogate the project and extract evidence. I begin with the project on generating radiology reports. So when a physician orders a chest X-ray, the scanner generates this image, and then the radiologist writes a report describing the reason for exam, factual findings, relevant next steps for course of action, and other sections. Okay, in this work, we focus on the image and the findings section of the report. This part of the report describes all of the noteworthy areas in an image, such as the heart, the lungs, placed medical devices, and so forth. So this is how we framed the task. The input is an image, and we want to feed that into a machine learning model, and then have it learn to output a report describing the findings. Being able to do this task well could improve clinical workflows. Machine learning strengths are being able to do tasks quickly, consistently, and at scale. And it could be especially useful in under-resourced areas like rural clinics and developing countries. So this is an overview of the model, and it has a lot of components to it, so I'm going to break it down. First, the image is fed into a convolutional neural network encoder to extract a 1,000 dimensional image embedding. That embedding is fed into a sentence level LSTM decoder, and it outputs what we call one topic vector per sentence. Each topic vector is decoded into its own sentence using a word level LSTM, and we add attention over the image into the word level decoder. We concatenate the sentences together to get a candidate report. And finally, during training, we optimize this process in 2 stages. First with cross entropy, and then with the reinforced training algorithm. Reinforcement learning allows us to incorporate downstream evaluation metrics into the learning process as rewards. The two rewards that we used are the evaluation metrics for generated text. On the left, we use CITER, which was developed in the general domain for image captioning, and it's based on weighted n-grams. On the right, we use Stanford's Checkspert sentence labeler to annotate both the reference report and the candidate report, and then compare their agreement. So for clarity, I summarized those details here, including the hyperparameters for reproducibility. We use a DenseNet for the image encoder, LSTMs for both the sentence and word level decoders. And then again, there's the two phases of the training optimization. First cross entropy and then reinforce. Cool, and we train this model on two public data sets, MimicCXR and Indiana University's data set hosted on OpenEye. MimicCXR is 2 orders of magnitude larger, and we had early access to MimicCXR at the time, making us the first work to do radiology report generation on a public data set this large. Here we show how our model compares against baselines and prior work. For both the natural language metrics and the Checkspert-based metrics, higher numbers are better. We show different results for when our model is fine-tuned using just the CITER-based reinforcement learning, just the Checkspert-based reinforcement learning, or with both. And we can see that our models handily outperform the baselines and previous work. Taking a closer look at the clinical correctness findings, we report how well each of the models do for each one of Checkspurt's 14 different labels. Here, the 14 labels are now rows and the models are now columns. And the rows are sorted based on how frequently that label occurs in the data. We can see that the most frequently occurring labels, for them, our model is doing the best. But for low frequency labels, both our models and other top models like TyNet start to do poorly. And all of these are deep models, which are data hungry. So it seems that maybe they're not learning from enough examples to be able to reliably identify things like fractures or lung lesions and so forth. In the aggregate, however, whether you weight by the label frequency or not, our Checkspert optimized model performs the best at this task. Finally, we look at the interpretability of the model. Excuse me. As I mentioned earlier, our word level decoder uses image attention. And this allows us to see what the model is quote unquote looking at when it's generating certain words. So for both of these examples, the model is correctly localizing positive findings. Like when it says chest, then it's looking at the chest, or when it says cardiomegaly, and it's looking at the heart. But interestingly, the model seems to invert the map when there's negation. So for both of the blue panels, when there's no pleural effusion and when there's no pneumothorax, rather than highlighting the lungs themselves, it highlights everything around the lungs. And this presents interesting opportunities for future work exploring more model interpretability. So now that I've explained the work itself, I shift to how we can use critical lenses to extract evidence and reflect on some of those lessons learned. So effective altruist organizations try to measure whether their time and money, where it can be doing the most good possible. And in order to decide which projects to invest in, some of them have developed this framework to evaluate a project based on its importance, neglectedness, and tractability. To demonstrate that tool, I apply the framework to this already completed project retrospectively, and this can help flesh out how a project defines success for itself. In the long term, generating radiologist quality reports with machines could be very beneficial to low resource areas, and it could also do things like eliminating human mistakes. However, healthcare is slow to adopt new technologies because of factors like patient safety, regulations, clinical workflows, whether the insurer will even reimburse for it in the long term, and so forth. So a short-term project likely would not be able to accomplish a deployed proof of concept actually impacting patients. This project's impact, however, we focused on doing early work in the space to shape how future researchers would be approaching the problem. And that would have some utility, although the impact of any single paper is usually modest. And so for that reason, I estimate a moderate importance. In EA, they try to precisely quantify importance using metrics like quality adjusted life years, but those analyses can often contain a false sense of precision. And in this work, I don't try putting exact specific numbers to importance, neglectedness, or tractability, because thinking critically through each of these factors is usually sufficient to understand what your project hopes to achieve and how. To measure the work's neglectedness, I looked at how many other researchers were doing chest X-ray report generation. Here I plotted the number of citations per year of the 3 chest X-ray data sets that have public reports. MimicCXR and PadChest, the 2 large data sets, were both released in early 2019. but because we had access to Mimic CXR in 2018, we were the first work to do report generation on data sets this large. Being early to the field helped us shape some of the modeling and evaluation decisions that others have adopted. And finally, tractability. I estimate that to be very high for this project. Essentially, we're bringing together some tools from the general domain, like the pieces of the model architecture, and we're optimizing for a domain-specific metric in radiology. And so the likelihood for success is high because we're exploring which parts of this new task and this new data set are interesting and worthy of additional investigation. So it's hard to go wrong. Another component of effective altruism is measuring the impact that interventions have actually had. So for this project, since the goal was to write an early paper that could hopefully be influential, to measure that, I looked at all 89 papers that cited our work in the 3 years since it was released. About half of them were also generating radiology, chest X-ray reports from images. The other half were doing things like literature reviews or citing us of radiology report generation as they worked on some other task. And so one trend that we saw is that even though our code was public, it was quite hard to get running. Only one paper actually got our code working, and then 2 others just re-implemented the model themselves. Everyone else either compared against our numbers straight from the paper using a different train test split, or they simply didn't compare against our model at all. And around 15 papers didn't compare against our model, but did compare against other models whose code was easier to get running. And this suggests that more works might have actually compared against us and built upon us if our code had been more accessible. So that's a lesson learned for sure. So we also saw that our work was cited frequently by researchers as the first to use Checkspert for a domain relevant evaluation metric for radiology report generation. A few papers expanded this further, such as by adding more terms to the reinforcement learning to penalize repetition, or by making a differentiable version of Checkspert so as to avoid RL altogether. And zooming out, it would be great to see more researchers employ this sort of after the fact impact reflection that their work has had, including shortcomings and what they might have done differently. So that project was about an early work exploring a new field using technical methods. Next, we move on to our second case study today, translating models from academic findings into real world impact. So to set the scene for this project, sorry, there's a little bit of a glare, at least from here. Hopefully you can kind of see things. So to set the scene for this project, let's rewind the clock back to my 2018 master's thesis. In that work, we were trying to understand why Black patients were experiencing higher levels of invasive care than white patients were during end of life. We explored the hypothesis during that thesis, which we explored hypothesis from earlier studies that the disparity might be driven by mistrust in the doctor-patient relationship. The hypothesis goes that if a doctor believes they've done all they can, say for your dad, they might recommend switching to comfort-based care in order for him to spend his final weeks not cooped up in a cold hospital that can be isolating, but instead at home with dignity, surrounded by loved ones and not hooked up to sort of tubes and machines. But if this is the first time you're hearing about the idea of quote unquote giving up and sort of not fighting and doing everything you can, if you're hearing this for the first time and you might be a little skeptical of your doctor, of the medical institution, you might think that maybe they just don't want to waste the resources on you and they're trying to push you out. And so you might say, no, keep fighting, do everything you can to save my dad, if you're not inclined to trust what the doctor is saying. And so my master's thesis measured a few different notions of mistrust and found that indeed, those notions were even more associated with high levels of invasive care than race was. But what can we do with that understanding of the racial disparity and the trust-based disparity? If we wanted to address the problem, where should we start? So we could try changing things at the hospital, such as by doing more patient surveys or more trainings for staff. Or maybe we could try avoiding the hospital altogether. So if there's mistrust when interacting with strangers, maybe the patients would rather be discussing their goals of care with someone they already know, preferably before they even get sick. And so that upstream intervention is what we decided to pursue for this project. So there are tools that we can use to learn the patient's wishes in advance, and that's things like living wills and advanced directives. And this process of advanced care planning is considered a best practice. And in an ideal world, every patient would have their wishes documented this way. However, doctors often find it very uncomfortable and difficult to talk to their patients about death, especially when the patients look healthy right now. They might put it off waiting for the exact right moment, and then that moment never ends up arriving in time. and the patient ends up in the hospital without clear documentation of their wishes. So if the doctors don't want to talk to every patient about this, perhaps we can use data to identify who's at highest risk and make sure at the very least the doctor is talking to them about advanced care planning. So a couple of years ago, I worked with a healthcare company to do just that. We partnered with primary care physicians because PCPs already have existing relationships of trust with their patients. We use data science to identify which patients are at highest risk and then notified their PCP so that they can have an advanced care planning discussion. However, that effort itself wasn't a research project, so I can't talk about its specific details. Instead, for the remainder of this project, I'm going to describe the kinds of factors to consider. First, based on building a similar model on public data, and second, based on a project where I interviewed research teams about their own experience deploying models. So for this task, we create a cohort of patients that pass away after being discharged. The goal is to predict whether a patient is going to pass away during the first year of discharge or if they'll live beyond that. We use billing codes, demographics, and additional administrative data to make these predictions. Our model is a gradient boosting classifier, and the feature space is 100-dimensional, about 100-dimensional, with mostly sparse features. And the results are reported based on averaging over 20 randomized runs, where each run has a different 70-30 train test split. Overall, the model does well at identifying patients who are at risk. Both the precision and the recall are about 2 out of 3. And this means that of the patients who would benefit from the intervention, we identify 67% of those patients. And we do so without too many false positives. Looking at the most predictive features, we see that a high SOFA severity score and having metastatic cancer are the 2 largest indicators of near-term mortality. But it's not enough to merely build an accurate model. If the interface is too clunky, then the doctors aren't going to use it. So one important consideration to think about is how you visualize the information. You could integrate the alerts directly into a clinic EHR. You could have a standalone iPad. You could build a smartphone with push notifications or many other ideas. And research teams have been experimenting with different interfaces with some promising examples already deployed in hospitals and beyond. Another consideration is making sure that the provider is bought into actually using your tool rather than ignoring it. So for instance, how should you set the alert threshold so as to avoid alarm fatigue? And what process do you use to come to that decision as a team? So some providers want to minimize false positives, whereas others are more willing to defer to the data team. And maybe that looks like having a fixed number of alerts per week. And there was actually one instance that I heard of where one of the doctors in a team was really set on the idea that the model needed to have high accuracy, even though for this data set or that data set, there was a class imbalance. And so accuracy wasn't a particularly meaningful metric. But this doctor insisted that they were quite busy and didn't have time to sort of like learn all of this new math. And they really, having high accuracy was important to them. And so the data team sort of needed to huddle together and figure out how to make this work. And they found that without much of a hit to recall, they would be able to, just get to 90% accuracy. And then hearing that made the doctor much happier. And, this is not a story, oh, haha, doctors don't know what they're talking about. It's about sort of like priorities and give and take. And like the data scientists could have said, these doctors are idiots. They don't know what's best for them. I'm just going to set this threshold and they'll deal with it. But if the doctor was treated that way, then they might just ignore the alert altogether. And so finding a way to work with the team and show that you're taking their concerns seriously is really important to making sure that your deployed model is successful. So for more guidance on having conversations with clinical collaborators and users, you could read our clinical collab sheets paper, which I'm particularly proud of. Okay, so the value of that project was in taking academic concepts from my master's thesis and applying them to a real world setting where we might be able to improve things. But how do we make sure that the intervention is actually mitigating racial biases rather than exacerbating them? So for the, for the evidence section of this project, I use a practice from both effective altruism and from data feminism, namely auditing. In 2020, Deb Raji introduced the SMACTR framework for how to incorporate oversight into algorithmic development and governance. So here I apply an abbreviated version of the SMACTR framework to the example model trained on public data from earlier. We begin with the scoping stage, and this is where we specify the expectations, requirements, and potential harms. There are some typical artifacts to generate here, such as a social impact assessment, and also spelling out how the system is supposed to be working. So for instance, two ways that the system could go wrong are if the model is biased against the subgroup, or if the delivery of the intervention spooks the patient and undermines the relationship of trust that they have with their doctor. And so by identifying those risks, we can design an intervention to mitigate those potential harms. In the mapping phase, we map out the stakeholders and the decision makers. And this is where an organization would discuss how the users would interact with the tool. We identify the metrics that we're going to use and which ones are most important. In this case, recall is the most meaningful pre-deployment metric because it measures of the people who need help, how many would we actually identify and be able to help. And then once a model is deployed and it has actual results, then the real impact is the most important thing to look at. So for instance, are the patients changing their end-of-life care decisions, and has the racial treatment disparity actually closed? And if not, one would need to rethink whether this is the right intervention to the problem or not. In the artifact collection stage, this is where we make sense of the different mappings and requirements from the earlier stages. And this informs which parts of the system to test closely. This is also where we analyze the data to create things like a data sheet for data set and a model card. In the testing stage, we evaluate the model's performance. We train the model on two different cohorts for comparison. Originally, we were building a model on the larger cohort on the left. This cohort contained all the patients that were discharged from the hospital, but after we noticed some strange results, we took a closer look. For comparison, we ran on another cohort, the cohort on the right, which was created by filtering only the patients that we knew passed away eventually, even if it was beyond 1 year of discharge. Because these different cohorts have different positivity rates, you can't compare across columns. Instead, you should be comparing across rows within a given column. And so the difference between these two cohorts essentially boils down to whether they think white patients or Black patients are at higher risk for 1 year mortality. The larger cohort seems to indicate that white patients are at higher risk for mortality, but that finding diverges from a large literature which suggests that Black patients have much higher mortality rates across a variety of settings. So what's going on here? When we plot the survival curve of the data set by race, we see that, as expected, Black patients are indeed dying at higher rates than white patients are. And so upon closer inspection, what we found is that what's happening here is there was a data collection in the larger cohort. It's important to know that the data generating process in order to understand how the bias was introduced. Mimic gets its death data from two different sources. When the patients pass away in the hospital, then the hospital has that information and shares it with Mimic. However, to know if a patient dies post-discharge after they leave the hospital, Mimic relies on Social Security records. However, in 2011, Social Security changed their policies to make it retroactively more difficult to share certain records depending on where they were collected. And this change ended up disproportionately undercounting some of the Black patients in the data. And as a result, the unfiltered cohort on the left has a biased view of who is at risk. Finally, in the reflection stage, we decide what to do in response to these findings. Our mitigation plan was to limit the final cohort to be the one on the right, where we only include patients for whom we know we have accurate death information. And this ensures that our example model on public data would not be undercounting the risks to Black patients. So far, both of these projects have been about how to thoughtfully design machine learning models, but there are other levers of action available to data scientists who want to be contributing to AI ethics. In this final project, I describe an effort to understand how tech workers can push their companies to act more ethically. A lot of really great scholarship in the algorithmic accountability space has focused on things like model audits and recommendations for standardized designs, like things like the SMACTR framework or data sheets for data sets. However, most of this work relies on voluntary adoption by the companies. But the areas where these practices would be most needed are probably the ones where the companies would be least willing to voluntarily set other incentives aside. Conferences like Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning, FACT, have spent less attention on how to push companies to adopt some of these great ideas. But we're not necessarily hopelessly at the mercy of these CEOs of the powerful companies. So for inspiration, we can look to some high profile incidents of tech workers organizing to push their companies to build more ethical products. In 2018, thousands of Googlers pushed Google to cancel their Project Maven defense contract. Was this an isolated incident, or is it a well-known example of a much larger trend in the tech sector? Okay, there we go. In this work, we use an archive which documents hundreds of instances of tech worker collective action. The data was collected by tech workers and academics to study these trends more comprehensively than just using anecdotes. So to analyze this archive, we use theories from political science and sociology. First, we use Gene Sharp's theories on nonviolent movements to characterize the landscape of the actions in the archive. Next, we use labor organizer Jane McAlevy's methods to understand how the workers built the infrastructure to perform these actions. And then finally, we observe some trends in how this field has been developing. Gene Sharp was an American political scientist in the 20th century. His work on nonviolent resistance was influential to pro-democracy movements in Serbia, Georgia, Belarus, and other nations. In part 2 of his landmark book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, he categorized 198 types of action, grouping them based on their methods, such as strikes, boycotts, protests, and so forth. Using Sharp's framework, we coded the 150 documented actions that had been tagged with the ethics label. By far, the most popular type of action was nonviolent protests, such as petitions and public demonstrations. So for instance, we see that in late 2016, thousands of tech workers signed the Never Again pledge to say that they would not build the Muslim registry that the Trump administration had suggested. As this pledge got more and more attention, workers were able to pressure their own companies into publicly committing to not building any such databases as well. Workers have also employed other tactics of non-cooperation against their own employers. So for instance, in 2020, some Amazon workers intentionally violated their company's policies around what they can and can't say about Amazon's impact on the climate. But these successful actions, they don't just come out of nowhere and they don't just happen on their own. Instead, they usually require weeks or months of preparation in order to attract participants and to be successful. So Jane McAlevy is a union organizer who got a PhD in sociology studying how workers build power successfully. By analyzing a dozen union drives, some successful, some unsuccessful, McAlevy identifies common techniques that successful campaigns employ in order to build power. So the most important place to start is with having a credible plan to win. McAlevy believes that one of the most common reasons that campaigns fail is because their leaders are not honest with themselves about how much power and effort it would take to achieve their goals. As an example of doing this successfully, we saw that the Never Again pledge had a credible plan to win. It began with the most passionate tech workers writing, signing, and circulating the pledge. And as it snowballed into thousands of employees, companies started to feel pressured to make statements as well. Each time one company made a statement of support, it put even more pressure on the other companies. And by the end, most of the big companies were eventually pushed to say that they wouldn't build the Muslim registry. And what made this plan credible is that there was a clear set of achievable steps along the road to success, as opposed to a big pie in the sky sort of, step one, question mark, profit. So even with a good hypothetical plan, how do organizers build support amongst the workers to begin with? This is where structure-based organizing comes into play. So rather than, so every organization has pre-existing relationships of respect and trust among the workers. Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and cold call everyone, successful campaigns organize within these existing structures. So this could be by floor, by department, by community, or otherwise. One example of this was when the Google LGBT Employee Resource Group used their existing listservs and infrastructure to pressure Google to change policies about queer content creators on YouTube. It was a pre-existing community that was able to leverage their networks in order to mobilize and for a successful action. And in order to understand how to know you're ready and how to mobilize for a successful action, we look at structure tests. Before taking public actions, campaigns need to run internal structure tests to make sure that they've built as much support as they think they have. So there's nothing more deflating than calling for a public demonstration that ends up having low turnout and then the other side sees your weaknesses. So instead, campaigns should start with smaller asks, such as attending an all-hands meeting or wearing a public button of support. Seeing how many people are following through on these smaller actions allows the campaign leaders to identify which departments they're weak in and where they need to be spending more time building support. So having characterized the landscape of actions in the archive and then examining the techniques used to build strong campaigns, we conclude this analysis by looking at some of the trends and considerations. One trend that we notice is that a large majority of the documented actions were petitions and symbolic protests. Some political science literature suggests that early wins could be coming from the so-called fog of enactment, which is where incumbents initially don't know how to respond to a new kind of tactic, and so the incumbents might miscalculate. Earlier efforts like the Never Again Pledge were successful potentially in part because tech workers had not been so vocal for causes like that in the past. So the companies didn't know how to respond and potentially gave more than they could have gotten away with. However, the decrease in apparent effectiveness of some of these tactics in recent years could suggest that the companies have learned they can just take a cycle of bad press and wait the organizers out if all you have are public petitions. And this is why McAlevey argues that successful campaigns need to build the ability to go beyond symbolic forms of power up to and including strikes. So with unionization campaigns starting to become more normal among tech companies, we'll see how the tech sector responds to the formal methods used by organized labor and whether this ends up changing the landscape of ethical design and so forth. We also observe some noteworthy aspects unique to the tech sector. So for one, Sharpe's framework doesn't anticipate domain expertise. However, the archive demonstrated multiple examples of technical experts using their skill set to give negative feasibility assessments. For example, experts opposed efforts from the Reagan administration to automate nuclear defense systems and opposed efforts from the Clinton administration to build backdoors to encryption. I see Hal is in this room, and I think he was part of the Clipper chip one. Danny as well, maybe? I don't know. Definitely Hal. So that's really cool that they're here. So by saying that these efforts were not technically feasible, they added an additional dimension of pressure to the campaign beyond just the traditional methods that Sharpe lays out. Another trend is that the tech companies are usually competing top talent to come work for them. And so unlike employers for teachers and for janitors, tech companies so far have been especially sensitive to negative attention that might hurt their ability to recruit the best workers. One possible area that campaigns might explore is actions to pressure their employer on that front, such as by running an unauthorized workplace climate survey. So in the final project, I have explored how tech worker collective action can serve as another legitimate lever for pursuing AI ethics in addition to efforts of thoughtful design. In the final evidence section of this talk, we interrogate the 7th principle of data feminism, which is to make labor visible. As we'll see, that notion can take on 2 different meanings depending on whose labor you're referring to, or I'm referring to. So we begin with the more conventional interpretation of making labor visible by examining the internal work that we did to conduct this research. Before even starting our project, we relied on the invisible labor of the creators of the tech collective action in tech archive. The archive was built by tech workers, union organizers, and a sociologist. And the creators started by searching tech articles for employment and organizing keywords. And then about 5% of the entries were created from crowdsourcing. Our journey on this project began with some of the authors doing our own organizing campaign a couple of years ago. Bianca and I were both organizers for a campaign to stop harassment and discrimination on campus at MIT. And seeing that the effort that went into building that campaign and how MIT responded was a very different experience than the traditional research experiences that we'd been used to up until that point. And these efforts got us thinking about tech worker collective action, and that's what led us to the archive. Over the spring and summer of 2021, Bianca, Catherine, and I discussed possible directions for the project and began annotating the archive to understand an initial landscape of the actions. That fall, we joined forces with Harini, who brought expertise both in designing visualizations and also as someone who knew what it was like to work at some of the largest tech companies listed there. And then once we had assembled the team, we iterated on frameworks of analysis and visualization leading to the project above. However, that was just one notion of making labor visible. An alternative interpretation is to think about the project's role in making organized labor more visible. But to really interrogate that, we need to consider visible to whom and what does it mean to be visible. So for this work, we're aiming to make organized labor more visible to the algorithmic fairness research community who cares about these goals and would like to pursue different directions. So the paper situates itself in the shared goals of algorithmic accountability, but we also observe that the 208 fact papers that have been published since the conference began in 2018, only 14 of those papers have abstracts that include any of the keywords used to construct the collective action in tech archive. So this suggests that there's room for growth in exploring this space. And what does it mean to make something visible? So the articles that are listed in the archive, they're all public. So isn't this already all visible? And we employ another principle of data feminism, which is to rethink binaries. Here, we apply that to the notion of visibility. It's not a single yes or no, visible or invisible. So to better understand this spectrum, consider an iceberg. We see only a small portion of it above the surface, but underwater, there are more layers of depth there. So we begin by looking at the individual newspaper articles in the archive, which correspond to the tip of the iceberg above water. It is visible to anyone who looks for it, but the larger structure might not be apparent. Next, we use Sharpe's framework to categorize the landscape and to understand the kinds of actions that have been happening. Deeper still, we use McAlevy's framework to see how organizers built that power outside of the public eye in general. And then finally, not included in our particular project, would be interviewing the campaign organizers themselves to understand their own strategy and decision-making for those specific instances and campaigns. And our project makes use of public articles and academic frameworks, and it's going to take important follow-up work in order to get that next level of visibility into the various campaigns. So in this talk, I demonstrated how the tools of effective altruism and data feminism can be applied to projects to extract evidence and learn from them. The case studies span different goals, from technical early academic work to a deployed model which addresses racial disparities to a sociological landscape analysis of tech worker ethics. If you'd like to read about the other case studies, including the challenges and joys of collaborating with clinical domain experts, I invite you to read the full thesis. And to recap, in this work, I propose that instead of being guided by abstract top-down principles, we should be learning bottom-up from case studies. The specifics of a case study can ground the conversation in a way that debating abstract principles cannot. And we can extract evidence from these case studies using critical lenses, such as effective altruism and data feminism, though of course there are many other lenses out there as well that one could use to try to learn from projects and case studies. And so as I wrap up, I wanted to leave with a parting thought based on a tweet that I saw earlier this month. So here, this doctor was lamenting that they used to believe in evidence-based medicine, but seeing how others have invoked that phrase, they now no longer believe it. And they're adopting probabilistic medicine as their preferred term and paradigm. And I just wanted to caution that although I do see where they're coming from, I'm not sure that this change is really gonna address their problems. So the issue that they're concerned with, to me, doesn't really seem to be what we're calling the field, but rather who decides what is evidence and how is evidence being used. So for instance, imagine if we all tomorrow adopt probabilistic medicine, and that's the phrase that we're all saying, and who could argue against that? But this doctor would still probably lament that the CDC and the FDA aren't updating the probabilities correctly in light of new evidence. So I think it's not really an issue of labels, it's more a proxy issue about power. And I think the same situation applies to AI ethics. And so whether you want to call it ethics or fairness or justice or something else, or whether we all agree on fairness is good, but whether this is fair or isn't fair, I think the same concerns of co-optation and power are going to arise if we're stuck in this space of abstract labels. So I personally don't think it's a particularly meaningful debate to get too caught up on the labels themselves. And instead, we should be focusing on the bottom up. So rather than what you say, looking at what you do and analyzing it and critiquing it and learning from it. Okay, so with that, I want to thank as many people as I possibly can that helped make this 6-year effort possible. And my friend Joe graduated last year, and in his thesis, he included this preface, and it just deeply resonated with me. It occurs to me that there exists in theory some maximum length that is socially acceptable for a thesis acknowledgement section, a length which is perhaps drastically exceeded here. For this, I make no apology, as the number of persons to whom I owe this degree is far from a mark of shame, a point of distinct pride. I cheer and applaud exactly what Joe says here, and I'm going to try to thank as many people as I can as well. So first, I need to thank my amazing partner, Cindy, who's on Zoom today. Thank you for keeping me sane, especially as I took on way too much this year, trying to write my thesis and do everything else. I love you, and I can't wait for the next of many chapters together. Next, it's impossible to thank everyone who deserves it, but I need to give a heartfelt thank you to all of my friends that I've made here at MIT. It's been a slog, especially during COVID, but the way we've sort of taken care of each other and nourished each other, it's impossible to overstate. A few specific shout outs. So Ajay for being my partner in crime for the last 2 years. You don't know it yet, but if I can't convince Vishwak to be the president of the CSC, I'm going to ask you. Becca for being my most emotionally intelligent friend and also for liking science policy and the Fast and Furious franchise. Irene for being one of the most impressive people that I've ever met and someone who inspires me to do better. Also many other people, Divya, Amanda, Bianca, Maz, Will, James, Akshay, Jonathan, Joanna, Hassan, Micah, Flora, Leilani, and many others. Also shout outs to my amazing roommates, Michael and Justin. Outside of MIT, to Dom, Taylor, Kate, Alyssa, my Patriots friends, Maggie, everyone who's supported Drake at Destination Imagination, and more. Oh, and especially this random person emailed me saying that they read my Good Dogs of Cambridge SIG TBD paper and sent me a picture of their dog and asked me to rate it for them. To all my fellow student worker advocates fighting to make MIT be its best self, being part of the group of students who worked on the 2020 ECS DEI petition is one of my proudest accomplishments in grad school. A special shout outs to Karis, Shen, Maddie, and Peter for being some of the most dedicated and inspiring people that I've worked with. And to all my union friends from our early days, Friday nights in a small room, to the RISE campaign, to winning the election and whatever is next in store, winning that contract. Special shout outs in particular to the CSC and to SPI for being so important to me during my time here. For the CSC, Sarah was the president when I started, and both she and John were so welcoming to me right away. And I can't say how much the two of them shaped how much the CSC means to me and how important it is to me that I carry on that legacy of being welcoming to others. For SPI, I've loved finding and helping grow the science policy community here at MIT. Serena was my vice president when I was president for a year at SPI. And this past year, she's been an even better president than I was. And I'm so impressed by my fellow SPIers, and I know that the organization is in great hands. Thank you to the staff, faculty, and many others who've been supportive of me and of so many others. These people have helped generations of students before me, and they're going to help generations of students after me. And I'm proud to have met them and worked with them. I also wanted to thank some role models that I've never actually met, including, among others, Tom Brady, Elena Kagan, and Barack Obama. More seriously, bringing it back to research communities that I've grown in. Thank you to IPRI, to Jonathan Frankel, and to Grace especially for helping me feel welcome and part of the IPRI community in early 2019 when I was trying to get more involved, and to Julius for hosting NBA Finals basketball watches. Taking and then TAing 6805 was one of the best experiences that I've had at MIT, especially TAing for Hal, who was a role model of mine before I even dreamed of coming to MIT and getting accepted. And so getting to work with him has been such an honor. To my MedG community, which has been an especially special place to work for the last 6 years, Pete's done an amazing job instilling a culture of collaboration, as we'll see on the next slide. And I became the senior PhD student halfway through my second year, and I had no idea what I was doing. And I hope I didn't make too many mistakes, but I think with practice over the years, I've grown into the role and hope I've done a good job sort of making others feel welcome there. Thank you to all of my many collaborators that I've gotten to work with. So Pete taught me the phrase that credit is infinitely divisible, and in my experience, it's even more than you could give credit. I think oftentimes you should be generous with credit and build bridge. I think Pete would agree with that, but I've just really experienced it. So people are going to remember the good collaboration, and then when they have another good idea, they're going to come to you because they like working with you. So in a lot of situations, you could decide whether you want the credit or whether you want to actually get something done, and you should choose getting something done. If you're successful, there's going to be credit to go around, and if you're unsuccessful, well, who wants credit for that? Okay, home stretch. Thank you to all of my managers, mentors, and champions from the 6 internships that Pete let me have while I was a grad student. Thank you to all of my year ops and MNGs that I've had the privilege of mentoring. These experiences have taught me a lot about myself and about how to try to bring out the best in others around me. Of course, it helps to have such brilliant and hardworking partners to be starting with. I'm proud that my year ops have collectively gotten 4, hopefully 5, TBD, papers published, and 2 of them have won summer research fellowships. And shout out to Mercy, who was here but had to go to a lab. I think I'll see her later today. Shout out to Mercy for recently getting accepted into an organization of women dedicated to public service. And Pete and I wrote a letter of recommendation for her. So I'm credit infinitely divisible. I'm going to take some credit for that, based off of her amazing achievements. Okay, nearly there. Thank you to my parents who are on the Zoom call for their constant support. Whether it's picking me up from the train because I missed the train to Boston, driving me to my summer internship all the way in DC, letting me come home to stay safe when there's a new worldwide pandemic. You're always there to support me whenever I need it. So thank you, and I love you both very much. And then finally, thank you so much to Pete, my advisor. And not just because you keep letting me get away with photoshopping silly hats onto you. You've been such an incredible mentor and role model throughout my time at grad school. Your kindness, patience, wisdom, and humor have been exactly what I needed. You gave me the space to explore my interests and research ideas, even when they seemed a little goofy to you, and maybe still do. I remember 4 years ago when my mom got into a car accident. My brother couldn't take much time off from work, and my dad had a real job, so he could only take a couple weeks before he needed to return to directing the people who worked for him. But Pete essentially let me take 2 months off. It was a very reduced workload, and I was able to, before the age of Zoom, sort of work from home. So I spent all of my time in the hospital and then moved back home to help mom for a couple months. And Pete was incredibly supportive, and he let me take the time that I needed. And I think that perfectly captures what makes Pete such a great mentor. As a result of giving me space, I spent a lot of my time interacting with nurses at the hospital, not all of which were sort of good experiences for me or for them. And that firsthand experience helped me think about how to explore doctor-patient tension and mistrust for my master's thesis. And I think it led to a better research project as a result. So he's not a carpenter that shapes exactly how he wants his students to turn out. He's a gardener that gives his students what they need to grow and be their best selves, whatever that might be. And I hope going forward that I'm as good a mentor to others as Pete has been to me. So with that, that is my thesis. And for more photos of great memories that have been able to be captured at MIT, you could go to this Dropbox link. And if there's not time to answer everyone's questions here, you can send unanswered questions or congratulations to my Gmail account, william.george.boag@gmail.com. I promise I'll respond to each message, although depending on how many there are, it might take days or I don't know, weeks. I don't know how many people are going to respond to me. So with that, thank you very much. Okay, I guess we got 5 minutes for questions. If anyone has any. Yes.
I'm curious, after doing so much research into tech worker organizing and those methodologies, looking back at your own experiences in the organizing efforts you were involved in, what would you change one thing about how you can approach organizing that you learn now?
Okay, so for those on Zoom, the question was, based on what I've learned from tech worker organizing, successful and unsuccessful experiences and sort of scholarship on that, how would I change what I've done organizing sort of my own in grad student spaces? One thing that I would try to emphasize as much as possible was, we didn't cover this bullet point, but within structure-based organizing, there's always organic leaders within a given unit. So that's often, it's hard to define, but it's like just the most trusted worker in that unit. It's the person who, if you don't know what to do, who do you turn to ask for help? The importance of having the campaign be led by organic leaders, so identifying them and then making sure that you found the right people is just such a critical role. Having them be the leaders in the campaign, I think, is a great way to make sure that you're in touch with what the community, what matters to the community. If someone maybe is concerned about something, they might not raise it on the Slack or however you're communicating, but they might bring it up to the person that they trust. I think we have time for one, maybe 2 more questions, if anyone has any. Oh, yes, anyone on Zoom? That is a great question. I have this weird setup here. I'm going to bring Zoom onto my real screen. Okay, great. I'm seeing lots of things in the chat. Are any of them questions? Lots of nice people. Lots of nice people. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Is there any questions in the Zoom chat that I missed? Oh, y'all are great. Okay, yes, question.
What was the most interesting, like, I guess, counterintuitive or unexpected thing you learned during the whole process of
So the question was, what's been the most interesting or counterintuitive thing that I've learned throughout the entire process? I mean, it's hard to know what's counterintuitive once you've been so steeped in it for a while. It's hard to remember what you don't know. I'll say the biggest sort of tension that I've been trying to navigate is how to do things that are technical enough to be respected by sort of technical people who care about technical things, but also broad enough to not get so narrowly defined into technical parameters that maybe can't solve the full problem, because there's only so many things that tech can do. And you don't really want to go too far in either direction. You don't want to be so loosey-goosey that it's not technical at all. You're sort of playing fast and loose. You certainly wouldn't have the respect of the technical community, but you also might confuse yourself because your terms don't add up, so to speak. So you don't want to go too far in either direction. And I think navigating that has been one of the trickiest parts. And the way that I've done that has just been having a diverse group of people that I'm accountable to who want to pull me in this direction or that direction. Question in the chat. Where would you be able to find that recording once you do it? So once I do it, I can either put it on YouTube or Dropbox. There will be a link somewhere. Email me at william.george.boag@gmail.com. I will for sure give you the link. Haven't really thought about it all, whether I'll post the talk on YouTube or something. So even if I don't, I will have the link. Email me at william.george.boag@gmail.com, and you could for sure get it there. Okay, I have limited time with my committee because scheduling is hard. So I think I'm going to have to kick all of you out. Thank you so much for coming. And yeah.